Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, let us slow things down, dim the lights, and step away from the bright, polished image of Christmas we know today. Before the glowing storefronts, before synthetic pine scents and perfectly wrapped gifts, there was another Santa Claus. A Santa shaped by cold winters, smoke-filled homes, and a world far less clean, far less comfortable, and far more mysterious than our own. This is not the Santa of shopping malls and cheerful jingles. This is a figure, born from survival, tradition, and centuries of human improvisation. A Santa who lived in a time when life was harder, medicine was uncertain, and even joy had a practical purpose. Tonight, we follow the trail backward not to ruin the magic, but to understand where it truly came from. When we imagine Santa Claus, we picture red velvet, clean white fur, and a scent of cookies and pine. But for most of history, winter itself was the enemy. Cold was not romantic. Darkness was not cozy. And Santa, in his earliest forms, belonged to a world where staying warm and staying alive mattered far more than appearances. Long before he became a global icon, Saint Nicholas was a quiet figure of generosity, rooted in hardship. His legend grew across Europe not as a symbol of abundance, but as reassurance during the most difficult season of the year. In winter, people feared hunger, illness, and isolation. Gifts were not luxuries. They were practical signs that someone had survived another year and hoped you would too. As centuries passed, Santa absorbed the character of the societies that believed in him. In medieval and early modern Europe, homes were dark, crowded, and smoky. Fireplaces burned constantly. Chimneys were rarely cleaned. The air inside was thick with coal smoke, damp wool, cooking fats, and unwashed bodies. This was the environment Santa entered, not a sparkling living room, but a space shaped by necessity. Hygiene, as we understand it today, barely existed. Clean water was precious. Bathing was rare. Clothes were worn repeatedly through the winter, absorbing smoke and moisture. In this world, Santa did not smell like sugar and snow. He smelled like the homes he visited because there was no escaping it. And yet, people welcomed him. Why? Because Santa was not about fantasy. He was about reassurance. His arrival meant the household had made it through another year. The fire still burned. The children were alive. There was food, however simple. In that sense, Santa was not a character of excess, but of endurance. By the Victorian era, this contrast became even sharper. The 19th century is often remembered for elegance, candlelight, and tradition. But beneath the surface, daily life was harsh. Industrial cities were crowded and polluted. Winters were long and unforgiving. Medical knowledge was limited, and remedies were often improvised. Santa, in this period, became a reflection of contradiction. He was cheerful, but surrounded by hardship. He was generous, but moved through spaces filled with struggle. The image of Santa smiling through soot and smoke made sense because everyone else was doing the same. Victorian families believed deeply in routine and ritual, especially during winter. Christmas became a moment to pause, gather, and endure together. Decorations were modest. Gifts were simple. And Santa, though joyful, was not distant from reality. He was part of it. This is why the historical Santa feels so different from the modern one. Today's Santa exists in a controlled environment. Climate-controlled rooms. Clean fabrics. Carefully curated scents. But the Santa of history existed, in a sensory world that was overwhelming. Every visit added layers: smoke, food, animals, dampness, until even his iconic red coat became a record of winter itself. And that was normal. No one expected Santa to be clean. Cleanliness was not a moral virtue yet. Survival was. A Santa who looked too pristine might even have seemed suspicious. How could someone untouched by soot understand winter? Even laughter sounded different in those homes. It echoed through low ceilings, thick air, and flickering firelight. Stories were told slowly. Silence was common. Sleep came early. In that context, Santa was less a spectacle and more a familiar presence, someone who belonged to the season's rhythm. This is where the modern misunderstanding begins. We often assume that joy must be bright and loud to be real. But historically, joy was quiet. It was sitting by a fire that did not go out. It was a warm drink. It was knowing that tomorrow, the sun would rise again, even if briefly. Santa symbolized that continuity. As his legend spread across cultures, each region added its own texture. In northern climates, Santa was bundled, practical, weather-worn. In cities, he smelled of smoke and streets. In rural areas, he carried the scent of animals and earth. But everywhere, he was tied to real life, not an escape from it. This grounding is what made Santa powerful. He was not an idealized figure above humanity. He was shaped by it. He walked the same streets. He endured the same winters. His generosity was meaningful because it existed in a world where nothing was guaranteed. And so, when we say the real Santa, we are not stripping away magic. We are uncovering it. Magic is not always clean. Sometimes it smells like effort. Sometimes it sounds like quiet breathing in a warm room. Sometimes it looks like a tired figure pressing forward anyway, because tradition matters. Tonight's story is not about shock or novelty. It is about perspective. The past was not gentle, but it was sincere. People celebrated Christmas not because life was easy, but because it was hard. Santa existed because people needed a symbol of kindness that could survive dirt, cold, and uncertainty. And somehow, he did. As we continue this journey deeper into the history of winter, medicine, survival, and tradition, remember this: the warmth we associate with Christmas was never about perfection. It was about persistence. About lighting a candle when darkness came early. About telling stories while the wind pressed against the walls. Santa smelled like history because he lived inside it. So settle in. Let the modern world fade for a moment. And together, let us walk back into a winter where Christmas was not about escape but about enduring. Together. Sweet dreams. As we continue our journey into the forgotten reality of Christmas past, we now move beyond the figure of Santa himself and step fully into the world he entered. A world that, by modern standards, would feel overwhelming almost immediately. This is Victorian Christmas, not the polished postcard version, but the lived experience of millions of people navigating winter with limited comfort, limited cleanliness, and relentless sensory intensity. To understand Victorian Christmas, we must first understand Victorian daily life. The 19th century was an age of progress, industry, and expansion, but it was also an age of smoke, crowding, and constant physical strain. Cities grew faster than infrastructure could support them. Streets were narrow. Homes were tightly packed. Waste disposal systems were primitive or non-existent. The air itself was heavy. Inside most homes, especially in working and middle-class households, there was no separation between daily living and survival. Cooking, heating, sleeping, and socializing all happened in the same limited space. Fires burned almost constantly during winter, not for comfort but for necessity. These fires filled rooms with soot and smoke that settled into walls, fabrics, and lungs. Cleanliness, as we understand it today, was not achievable. Running water was rare. Hot water even rarer. Baths were infrequent, often seasonal rather than weekly. Clothes were layered and worn repeatedly, absorbing smoke, moisture, and body odor. During winter, washing garments was difficult, sometimes impossible, due to freezing temperatures. Christmas arrived not in a fresh environment, but in one already burdened by months of accumulated smells. Coal smoke dominated everything. It clung to curtains, hair, furniture, and skin. Add to this the smell of cooked meats, boiled vegetables, damp wool, unwashed bodies, and nearby animals, and you begin to sense what Victorian homes were like. These were not unpleasant smells to the people living there, they were familiar. They were the smell of life continuing. Hygiene was not ignored out of laziness. It was limited by reality. Soap was expensive. Clean water had to be carried. Drains were unreliable. In poorer areas, shared privies overflowed, especially during winter freezes. Even wealthier households struggled with sanitation by modern standards. And yet, Christmas still mattered. In fact, Christmas mattered more because of these conditions. The season offered psychological relief, not physical escape. Decorations were simple greenery, candles, handmade ornaments, but they introduced change into monotonous winter spaces. A pine branch brought a different scent. A candle added warmth and light that felt symbolic rather than merely functional. Food played a central role, but it too reflected reality. Christmas meals were heavy, rich, and designed to sustain the body through cold days. Roasted meats, puddings, dense breads, and spiced drinks were not indulgences alone, they were fuel. The smells of cooking filled homes for hours, blending with smoke and damp air. These aromas marked Christmas just as clearly as bells or songs. The scent of boiling pudding, spiced wine, or roasting meat cut through the usual winter odors, signaling that this day was different. Even if the home was crowded and smoky, something special was happening. Victorian Christmas was deeply sensory, but not in a gentle way. It was loud with clattering dishes, crackling fires, and street noise outside. It was visually dim, lit by candles and firelight that cast long shadows. And it was aromatic to the point of excess. Outside, the streets were no cleaner. Horse-drawn traffic filled roads with mud and waste. Snow mixed with soot, turning slush dark and slippery. Vendors sold food, drinks, and seasonal goods in tightly packed markets where smells overlapped and intensified. When families returned home from church or visiting neighbors, they brought the street with them on their boots, coats, and breath. Nothing was sealed off. Indoor and outdoor life blended together. This context is essential to understanding why the historical image of Christmas feels so different from ours. Today, we associate Christmas with freshness, pine, citrus, clean linens, crisp air. But Victorian Christmas was layered, heavy, and thick with accumulated life. And this was normal. Children grew up in this environment without question. They slept multiple to a bed. They shared rooms with siblings, sometimes with adults. The idea of personal space barely existed. At night, the combined warmth of bodies was necessary to survive the cold. Christmas morning did not reveal pristine surroundings. It revealed continuity. The fire still burned. The roof still held. The family was still together. That was the miracle. This also shaped Victorian attitudes toward comfort and pleasure. Comfort was not about removing discomfort entirely. It was about managing it. A warm drink mattered more than a clean cup. A full stomach mattered more than a spotless table. Even the famous Victorian emphasis on morality and manners coexisted with physical hardship. Families might dress carefully for Christmas dinner, but those clothes were worn over undergarments that had not been washed for weeks. Appearances were maintained not because life was clean, but because dignity mattered. In this world, Santa Claus did not stand out as an anomaly. He fit in. A figure entering homes through chimneys, covered in soot, made sense. Chimneys were dirty. Fireplaces were dangerous. Anyone who used them accepted that mess was unavoidable. The idea of a spotless Santa would have seemed unrealistic. What modern audiences often miss is that Victorian people were not unaware of dirt or disease. They simply lacked the tools to control them. Germ theory was still developing. Many illnesses were poorly understood. Smells were often associated with sickness, but avoiding them entirely was impossible. So instead, people adapted psychologically. They normalized conditions that would shock us today. They focused on rituals, stories, and traditions to give meaning to an environment they could not easily change. Christmas was one of those anchors. Songs were sung not because voices were perfect, but because singing together mattered. Candles were lit despite fire risks because darkness felt heavier without them. Food was shared even when supplies were limited because generosity strengthened social bonds. And Santa, whether imagined or embodied by a family member, represented the promise that kindness could exist even in imperfect surroundings. Understanding this helps us appreciate the resilience embedded in Victorian Christmas traditions. They were not born from comfort. They were born from necessity. The warmth we associate with Christmas was emotional warmth, not environmental ease. As we move forward in this story, we will see how these harsh living conditions shaped everything else from medicine to parenting, from holiday customs to bedtime rituals. The overwhelming smells and crowded spaces of Victorian life set the stage for choices that may seem strange today, but once made sense. For now, remember this: Victorian Christmas was not clean, quiet, or gentle. It was alive, dense, human. And within that chaos, people still found ways to celebrate, to hope, and to carry traditions forward. That, perhaps, is the most enduring gift they left behind. As we move deeper into the world of Victorian Christmas, we now enter an aspect of history that feels especially distant from modern life, not because it was hidden, but because it was once completely ordinary. This is the story of medicine during the 19th century, and how substances we now view with caution were once trusted companions in daily life, particularly during winter and the holiday season. In Victorian society, illness was not an occasional inconvenience. It was a constant presence. Cold weather weakened bodies already strained by long working hours, poor nutrition, and polluted air. Coughs lingered. Fevers returned again and again. Pain was something most people simply lived with. Modern medicine did not yet exist in any recognizable form. There were no antibiotics. Pain relief options were limited. Doctors were scarce, especially for the working class. Instead, people relied on apothecaries, home remedies, and bottled solutions sold openly and confidently. Among these remedies, opium held a central place. Opium was not considered dangerous in the way we understand today. It was viewed as reliable, effective, and versatile. It eased pain. It quieted coughs. It calmed nerves. It helped people sleep. For families facing long, dark winters, these effects were not indulgent, they were practical. Opium-based medicines appeared in many forms: tinctures, syrups, lozenges, powders, and tonics. One of the most common was laudanum, a liquid solution made by dissolving opium in alcohol. It was widely available, inexpensive, and often recommended by pharmacists for a wide range of complaints. During Christmas time, its use increased. Winter intensified physical discomfort. Cold air aggravated lungs. Damp homes worsened joint pain. Anxiety rose as food supplies were stretched and daylight disappeared early. The holiday season, while emotionally important, was physically exhausting. Opium-based remedies offered relief. They were used to calm persistent coughs after long church services in freezing buildings. They were used to help children sleep through the night when illness or restlessness struck. They were used by adults to dull aches after days of labor and preparation. Importantly, these medicines were not hidden or whispered about. They were part of normal household routines. Bottles sat on shelves alongside cooking ingredients. Doses were measured casually, often by instinct rather than instruction. Warning labels, standardized dosages, and long-term studies did not exist. People trusted what seemed to work. During Christmas gatherings, the presence of opium-based products blended seamlessly into the atmosphere. A warm drink might include a medicinal additive. A cough syrup might be taken before bed. A tonic might be shared among adults to ease fatigue and tension. The result was a holiday environment that felt quieter, slower, and heavier than modern celebrations. Children, in particular, experienced Christmas differently. Childhood in the Victorian era was not sheltered. Children worked, contributed to households, and were exposed to illness early. When they became sick or restless, opium-based syrups were often used to help them rest. From a modern perspective, this feels alarming. But in its historical context, it was an act of care. Parents were not trying to suppress joy, they were trying to ensure survival. A sleeping child was a breathing child. Rest was seen as healing. Christmas nights, therefore, were often unusually calm. Fires crackled. Adults spoke quietly. Children slept deeply. The house settled into a subdued rhythm that matched the long winter darkness outside. This atmosphere influenced how Christmas memories were formed. The holiday was not defined by noise or constant activity. It was defined by stillness, by warmth, by the feeling of being enclosed and protected from the cold. Opium, in this sense, was not perceived as an escape. It was a stabilizer. Even emotional distress was treated physically. Sadness, anxiety, and what we might now recognize as seasonal depression were often labeled as nervous complaints. Opium-based tonics promised relief from these feelings, especially during winter holidays when expectations of joy clashed with harsh reality. Christmas could be emotionally heavy. Memories of loss were common. Death was not distant in Victorian life. Empty chairs at the table were frequent reminders of recent grief. Medicines that softened emotional edges were welcomed. This is another reason Santa's world felt different. A house filled with drowsy calm, dim firelight, and slow breathing was normal. Santa arriving quietly made sense. Silence was not suspicious, it was expected. The broader society reinforced this acceptance. Opium was legal. It was taxed. It was imported and distributed openly. Doctors wrote about it in medical journals. Advertisements praised its effectiveness. There was little concept of addiction as we define it today. Dependency was often interpreted as necessity. If a substance allowed someone to function, it was considered helpful. Christmas traditions absorbed this mindset naturally. The holiday was not about stimulation. It was about comfort and endurance. Anything that helped people endure winter was embraced. This does not mean Victorian people were unaware of risk. Some recognized that overuse could be harmful. But alternatives were few. The choice was often between discomfort and relief, not between safety and danger. As the night grew colder and longer, households prioritized rest. Fires were banked. Curtains were drawn. Candles were extinguished carefully. And sleep, often assisted by medicine, became the body's way of surviving winter. Understanding this context reshapes how we interpret historical Christmas scenes. The quiet homes. The slow pace. The absence of constant activity. These were not signs of emptiness but of adaptation. The modern idea of Christmas as loud, bright, and endlessly energetic would have felt strange to a Victorian family. Energy was precious. Calm was valued. Opium-based medicines helped create that calm. As we move forward, we will see how this widespread use influenced parenting, nighttime routines, and even the myths that grew around Santa's ability to move unseen through sleeping households. For now, remember this: Victorian Christmas was shaped not only by tradition and belief, but by chemistry, by substances that soothed bodies and minds in a world that rarely offered rest on its own. In a season defined by cold and uncertainty, sleep was a gift. And anything that encouraged it became part of the holiday, quietly and without question. As our story continues, we now step into a familiar but often misunderstood space of Victorian life, the apothecary shop. To modern eyes, these shops may look charming, even quaint wooden shelves, glass bottles, handwritten labels, and the comforting idea of local remedies. But in reality, apothecaries were something much closer to today's supermarkets, pharmacies, and wellness stores combined, operating in a world without modern regulation or scientific certainty. In the 19th century, the apothecary was often the first and sometimes only source of medical help. Doctors were expensive, distant, or unavailable. Hospitals were places people feared, not trusted. For everyday ailments, families turned to local pharmacists who mixed, bottled, and sold remedies based on tradition, experience, and popular belief. There were no standardized formulas. No clinical trials. No government oversight. Each bottle represented trust that what had worked before would work again. Shelves were lined with liquids of deep amber, green, or cloudy brown. Powders sat in paper packets. Syrups were poured into reused glass containers. Labels promised relief from pain, coughs, restlessness, sadness, and fatigue. The language was confident, reassuring, and rarely specific. Terms like soothing, restorative, and calming appeared frequently. Side effects were not discussed. Long-term consequences were barely considered. If something eased symptoms quickly, it was seen as effective. During winter, and especially around Christmas, these shops became even more important. Cold weather brought waves of illness. Persistent coughs echoed through households. Joints stiffened. Sleep became difficult in unheated rooms. Emotional strain increased as families navigated loss, scarcity, and isolation. Apothecaries responded with solutions, or at least, promises of solutions. Christmas preparations often included visits to these shops. Families stocked up on remedies alongside food and candles. Bottles of cough syrup, tonics, and sleep aids became part of the seasonal routine, just as essential as flour or coal. These products were sold openly to adults and children alike. From a modern perspective, this lack of restriction feels alarming. But it reflects the medical understanding of the time. The body was seen as something that could be balanced and calmed. Medicines were believed to restore harmony rather than alter chemistry in complex ways. The idea that repeated use of a substance might lead to long-term harm was not widely accepted. Immediate relief mattered more than future risk. Winter was long. Survival was immediate. Apothecaries themselves were not villains. Many were skilled, attentive, and deeply embedded in their communities. They listened to customers. They remembered families. They adjusted mixtures based on feedback. Their authority came from familiarity, not from scientific credentials. In many ways, they filled the emotional role doctors fill today. They reassured anxious parents. They offered comfort to the elderly. They provided a sense of control in a world where illness felt random and frightening. Christmas intensified this reliance. The holiday brought expectations of joy, togetherness, and celebration that reality did not always support. When someone fell ill during Christmas, the disappointment felt sharper. When a child cried through the night or an adult struggled with pain, families turned quickly to whatever promised relief. Apothecaries responded with confidence. A bottle passed across the counter carried not just medicine, but hope. The lack of warning labels was not seen as negligence. It was simply the norm. Information moved slowly. Knowledge was passed by word of mouth. If a remedy had been used for years, it was assumed to be safe. Even the concept of dosage was flexible. Instructions like a spoonful as needed were common. Measurements depended on household spoons, not standardized tools. Adjustments were made based on age, size, and instinct. This informality shaped how medicine was experienced. Remedies became part of daily life rather than specialized interventions. They were taken without ceremony, often alongside meals or before bed. During Christmas nights, especially, medicine blended into ritual. A cough syrup before sleep. A calming tonic after a long day. A spoonful offered with gentle reassurance. The result was a household atmosphere that felt slower, quieter, and more subdued, an environment where silence was not absence, but rest. This context helps explain why Victorian Christmas stories often feel muted compared to modern celebrations. There is less chaos, less constant stimulation. People moved carefully. They conserved energy. Medicine supported this rhythm rather than disrupting it. Apothecaries also influenced the language of comfort. Terms like settling the nerves or easing the spirits reflected a belief that emotional and physical states were closely linked. Remedies promised balance rather than excitement. This fit naturally into winter traditions. Christmas was not about excess energy. It was about stability. Anything that reduced discomfort was welcomed. As the century progressed, some concerns did emerge. Writers, doctors, and reformers began questioning the overuse of certain remedies. But change was slow. Regulation came gradually, and for much of the Victorian period, trust remained high. For families living through cold winters with limited resources, the immediate benefits outweighed abstract risks. The future felt uncertain. Relief felt real. Understanding this helps us see Victorian Christmas not as reckless, but as pragmatic. People used the tools available to them. They made choices based on experience, not hindsight. Santa's quiet passage through sleeping homes makes more sense in this context. A household at rest was not unusual. Deep sleep was valued. Silence was comforting. The apothecary, though rarely mentioned in Christmas stories, played a quiet but essential role in shaping the season's atmosphere. Without modern medicine, these shops helped create the conditions that allowed families to gather, rest, and endure winter together. As we continue, we will explore how these freely available remedies influenced parenting, bedtime routines, and the cultural acceptance of long, quiet nights during the holiday season. For now, remember this: Victorian medicine was not hidden, controlled, or heavily regulated. It was visible, trusted, and woven into everyday life, especially at Christmas, when comfort mattered most. And in a world where winter demanded endurance, the apothecary stood as a symbol of reassurance, offering simple answers to complex problems, one bottle at a time. As we move further into the atmosphere of a Victorian Christmas, we now arrive at the heart of the home, the holiday gathering itself. This is where tradition, medicine, necessity, and emotion quietly blended together. To modern eyes, a Christmas gathering is loud, energetic, and filled with constant activity. But in the Victorian era, the holiday often unfolded very differently. Christmas gatherings were not designed to excite the senses. They were designed to steady them. The Victorian household was already under strain long before Christmas Day arrived. Weeks of cold weather, limited daylight, physical labor, and emotional fatigue weighed heavily on everyone inside. The holiday was meant to bring comfort, not stimulation. And so, the foods and drinks shared during Christmas reflected that purpose. Many traditional winter beverages were warming, heavy, and calming. Spiced wines, herbal punches, thick ales, and medicinal teas were common. These drinks were valued not for sharp flavor or celebration alone, but for how they made the body feel warmer, slower, more relaxed. Some of these beverages included ingredients commonly associated with medicine. Herbal extracts, alcohol, and calming additives were often combined without clear separation between food and remedy. This was not hidden or deceptive. It was simply how winter nourishment worked. During Christmas, when everyone gathered indoors for long periods, these drinks circulated freely. A cup was offered to ease cold fingers. Another to calm a persistent cough. Another to help an elderly guest settle comfortably by the fire. The effect was subtle but cumulative. Conversations slowed. Movements became deliberate. The household settled into a gentle stillness that felt appropriate for the season. This was not seen as dullness. It was seen as understanding the body's limits during winter. Food itself played a similar role. Christmas meals were heavy and filling. Roasted meats, dense puddings, breads soaked in fats and syrups. These dishes required energy to digest and naturally encouraged rest afterward. Meals were often followed by long periods of sitting, quiet conversation, or sleep. Children were not expected to remain endlessly active. Adults did not push themselves to perform cheerfulness. Fatigue was acknowledged rather than resisted. In some households, calming syrups or tonics were offered alongside food, especially if someone appeared restless, unwell, or overtired. This was framed as care, not control. A calm household was considered a healthy household. For children, Christmas evenings were often surprisingly quiet. After a day of modest excitement, perhaps a small gift, a special treat, or a visit from relatives, they were encouraged to rest. Deep sleep was valued, especially during winter nights when cold and illness felt closest. This calm environment shaped how Christmas was remembered. Memories were not of chaos, but of warmth. Of firelight flickering against walls. Of hushed voices and slow breathing. Of safety inside while the cold pressed against the windows. From a modern perspective, this may seem subdued. But within its historical context, it made perfect sense. Victorian people did not associate joy with constant movement. They associated it with stability, with knowing that everyone in the room was settled, warm, and present. A quiet room meant nothing was wrong. Holiday gatherings were often long rather than intense. People arrived early and stayed late. Time was not structured around entertainment schedules, but around daylight, meals, and fatigue. Music, if present, was gentle. Singing happened in short bursts. Instruments were played softly. Silence was not awkward. It was expected. Even laughter was quieter. Drinks and foods that encouraged relaxation fit naturally into this rhythm. They softened the edges of discomfort. They reduced coughing, restlessness, and tension. They allowed people to remain together without exhaustion. This environment also reinforced the cultural image of Christmas night as a time of deep rest. Stories emphasized sleeping households, glowing fires, and quiet streets. The idea that everyone would be awake late into the night was uncommon. Santa's role, again, fits perfectly here. A visitor who arrived silently, left small tokens, and departed without disruption belonged in a world where stillness was the goal. The expectation that homes would be quiet made such stories believable. A loud, restless household would have seemed unusual. It is important to note that these practices were not about removing emotion. On the contrary, they made space for it. In a calm setting, grief could be acknowledged. Fatigue could be admitted. Contentment could exist without performance. Christmas gatherings were also moments of reflection. People spoke about the year that had passed. About those who were no longer present. About hopes for the coming spring. These conversations did not require excitement. They required calm. The sensory environment supported this. Dim light. Warm drinks. Heavy food. Slow digestion. Everything worked together to encourage introspection. This contrasts sharply with modern holiday expectations, where stimulation is often constant. Noise, brightness, and activity are now seen as signs of success. But in the Victorian world, excess stimulation would have been exhausting, even threatening. Winter demanded conservation. The quiet, drowsy atmosphere of Victorian Christmas gatherings was therefore not accidental. It was adaptive. It allowed families to endure the hardest season together without pushing bodies beyond their limits. Understanding this helps us reinterpret historical descriptions of Christmas that may seem uneventful to us today. The absence of excitement was not a failure of celebration. It was the celebration. As we move forward, we will see how this calm extended into bedtime routines, nighttime beliefs, and the cultural acceptance of deep, uninterrupted sleep during Christmas, a sleep that became central to the myths and traditions that followed. For now, remember this: Victorian Christmas gatherings were not designed to impress. They were designed to sustain. In a world shaped by cold and uncertainty, a quiet room full of warm, resting people was the greatest gift of all. As we continue deeper into the physical world of a Victorian Christmas, it is time to look closely at one of the most familiar images in holiday tradition: Santa Claus entering homes through the chimney. Today, this idea feels whimsical and clean, almost theatrical. But in the 19th century, chimneys were neither charming nor symbolic. They were dangerous, dirty, and absolutely essential to survival. To understand Santa's journey, we must first understand the Victorian chimney itself. In most homes, the fireplace was the heart of the house. It provided heat, light, and a place to cook. During winter, it burned nearly constantly. Coal, wood, peat, whatever fuel was available was fed into the fire day and night. As a result, chimneys accumulated layers of soot, grease, ash, and debris. Chimney cleaning was irregular at best. Professional chimney sweeps existed, but many families could not afford them. Even when cleaning occurred, it was incomplete by modern standards. Narrow flues, sharp bends, and uneven brickwork trapped residue that built up year after year. Inside these chimneys lived more than smoke. Birds nested there. Rats climbed through. Insects found warmth. Occasionally, debris from rooftops fell inside. Chimneys were ecosystems of darkness and residue, shaped by long-term use rather than maintenance. For a human to enter such a space would have been deeply unpleasant and potentially dangerous. Victorian chimneys were narrow. Some were barely wide enough for a child, which is why child chimney sweeps were tragically common during this period. These children worked in confined, airless spaces, scraping soot while breathing in smoke and dust. Their existence is an uncomfortable reminder of how hazardous chimneys truly were. Against this backdrop, the idea of Santa descending through chimneys becomes less magical and more symbolic of endurance. A figure entering through soot-filled brickwork, squeezing through tight spaces, and emerging into a smoky room made sense to Victorian imaginations because chimneys were familiar hazards. Everyone knew how dirty they were. Everyone knew how essential they were. A Santa untouched by soot would have seemed unrealistic. The soot itself deserves attention. It was not a light dusting. Coal soot was thick, greasy, and clung aggressively to fabric and skin. It stained clothing permanently. It settled into hair and beards. It coated the inside of lungs. Anyone who spent time near fireplaces carried the smell with them. Santa, by definition, would have carried the accumulated scent of every home he visited. This reality shaped the sensory logic of the myth. Santa did not arrive smelling like sweets or snow. He smelled like winter itself: smoke, ash, and warmth. Emerging from the fireplace also meant stepping into a room that was already smoky. Victorian homes lacked proper ventilation. Fireplaces drew air inconsistently. Smoke often leaked into living spaces, especially during cold, still nights. Rooms were dim. Shadows flickered. Furniture was placed close to the fire for warmth. A figure appearing from the hearth would have felt sudden, but not impossible. Importantly, fireplaces were not decorative. They were dangerous. Sparks could ignite clothing. Chimney fires were a constant threat. Families treated fireplaces with respect, not nostalgia. This danger adds another layer to the Santa myth. A visitor who could safely navigate the chimney and hearth possessed an almost supernatural familiarity with winter hazards. He knew where to step. He knew how to avoid sparks. He belonged to the fire. In Victorian storytelling, this mattered. Myths often arose from exaggerating familiarity, not inventing the impossible. Santa was not magical because he did impossible things, he was magical because he mastered what everyone feared. The hearth was also a symbolic threshold. It separated inside from outside, warmth from cold, safety from exposure. Entering through the chimney was not just practical, it was meaningful. Santa crossed the boundary that winter made so important. This symbolism only works in a world where fireplaces were central. Modern homes, with central heating and sealed walls, have lost this relationship with fire. But Victorian families lived beside it constantly. Clothes drying by the fire absorbed smoke. Food cooked over it carried its flavor. Skin warmed by it smelled of ash. Santa's red coat, imagined as heavy wool, would have absorbed these scents instantly. After dozens of houses, the coat would have become a record of the night, each stop adding another layer of smoke, grease, and warmth. This is why historical depictions of Santa often show him rugged rather than pristine. His clothes are thick. His boots are worn. His beard is full and untrimmed. These details reflect a world where neatness was secondary to function. Even the act of climbing down chimneys speaks to physical endurance. Victorian Santa was not imagined as weightless. He was sturdy, capable, someone who could endure discomfort for the sake of tradition. And tradition mattered. Fireplaces were often decorated during Christmas, but never abandoned. Greenery might be hung nearby. Candles placed carefully on the mantel. Stockings were hung by the fire not for decoration alone, but because it was the warmest place in the house. The warmth helped dry small gifts. It kept food from freezing. It symbolized life continuing through winter. Santa appearing at the fireplace reinforced this symbolism. He emerged from the source of warmth itself. The messiness of the chimney was not a flaw in the story. It was the point. Christmas was not about cleanliness. It was about comfort. And comfort, in winter, came from fire with all its smoke and risk. This perspective also explains why Santa was imagined as resilient rather than delicate. He did not glide through windows. He forced his way through soot and brick. He was shaped by the same environment as everyone else. The chimney journey was a shared understanding between storyteller and listener. Everyone knew how unpleasant it was. Everyone knew how necessary it was. So when children were told Santa came down the chimney, they did not imagine a sparkling entrance. They imagined a familiar one. A practical one. As we move forward, we will see how this physical reality influenced Santa's appearance, his clothing, and even his temperament, turning him into a figure who felt believable precisely because he was weathered. For now, remember this: Victorian chimneys were not symbols of comfort alone. They were symbols of survival. And Santa's journey through them reflects a world where enduring dirt, danger, and discomfort was simply part of winter life. In that world, magic did not avoid hardship. It moved straight through it. As we continue our journey through the physical and sensory world of a Victorian Christmas, we now arrive at the story of what happens after Santa has squeezed through the chimneys, specifically, how his clothing became more than protection. It became a living record of winter itself. Imagine the world through the lens of a Victorian home. Houses were small and densely packed. Heating relied almost entirely on fireplaces. Every home carried its own combination of smells, textures, and temperatures. Coal smoke, peat fires, the sharp tang of iron from cooking utensils, the musky warmth of livestock. Even the lingering scent of winter herbs hung in the air. For a figure like Santa, who traveled from home to home, these environments were imprinted directly onto his clothing. His coat, traditionally depicted as a deep, rich red wool, was not just a decorative garment. Wool was thick, rough, and capable of absorbing scent. By the end of a long night, his coat, gloves, and hat would carry the faint but persistent smell of soot, coal, and wood smoke. Even the scent of damp boots, carried in from snow-covered streets or frozen garden paths, clung stubbornly to the fabric. This was not unpleasant in the Victorian imagination. It signified authenticity. Santa was not a distant, untouchable figure. He bore the world of winter on his shoulders, literally. The sensory record did not stop with smell. The texture of his coat changed, too. Wool, heavy with moisture from damp streets, condensation from chimneys, or even the touch of curious hands reaching for treats, absorbed a variety of physical textures. Ash clung in small patches. Tiny bits of soot, dust, and feathers from rooftop birds became embedded in the fibers. By the time dawn arrived, Santa's coat was a composite of every home he visited, a tactile record of the entire winter landscape. Victorian children, who were taught to respect Santa as a hard-working visitor, would imagine him not as pristine and polished but as rugged, heavy, and enduring. The dirt and smells of his coat were a testament to his labor and dedication. Each home added a layer to his persona, much like pages in a diary. This made Santa not only magical in his abilities but relatable in his endurance. Children understood that the journey required more than gifts. It required resilience, adaptation, and an intimate knowledge of the world he traversed. This absorption of environmental detail also influenced the storytelling around Santa's appearance. Writers and illustrators often emphasized his rugged, lived-in look. Thick gloves, worn boots, a slightly ragged hat, every element suggested contact, experience, and a life spent navigating winter's challenges. In contrast to modern sanitized depictions, Victorian Santa was tactile. His physicality was proof of effort and perseverance, a visual and olfactory marker of the harsh realities of winter. In addition, the smells and textures of his clothing acted as a form of memory. Each home left a trace, and each trace contributed to the overall narrative of Christmas night. Wool that had brushed against stockings, fireplaces, and rooftops carried subtle hints of each family, creating a layered sensory story. Even the faintest odor of burned marshmallow here, a touch of pine there, would have been legible in the mind of a child attuned to sensory details. This is an important point. The magic of Victorian Santa was not abstract. It was grounded in tangible experiences. His clothing communicated the reality of his journey in a way that children could imagine and believe. Moreover, this sensory record reflected social realities. Homes were not uniform. Some smelled of fresh-baked bread, while others carried the lingering stench of coal smoke or livestock. Santa's coat became a patchwork, a map of different socio-economic environments. The story conveyed more than the simple act of gift-giving. It illustrated the diversity of life in winter, reinforcing the idea that magic touched all homes, regardless of wealth or cleanliness. His gloves, too, were not immune. Worn and practical, they collected traces of soot and dust. They absorbed the subtle warmth of hearths and the chill of icy chimneys. Hands that were imagined as delicate in modern culture were, in Victorian stories, strong and capable, another visual lesson in resilience and adaptability. Gloves told the story of labor as much as generosity. The interaction between Santa's clothing and his environment also contributed to a subtle narrative about winter's harshness. Children were aware that the holiday season was cold and demanding. A Santa who appeared pristine and untouched would have seemed disconnected from the realities of their lives. Instead, his well-worn coat, gloves, and boots symbolized his shared experience of winter. He was not outside the world of cold and soot, he was within it, enduring it, and emerging victorious with gifts in hand. This layering of scent, texture, and wear also reinforced a moral lesson common in Victorian storytelling: preparation, perseverance, and endurance are rewarded. Santa did not merely arrive magically. He prepared, he endured, he interacted with his environment in ways that were difficult and sometimes unpleasant. His coat was evidence of this effort, a silent testament to the labor behind the wonder. From a historical perspective, this detail also illustrates how material culture shapes myth. Victorian households were full of objects with memory and scent: fireplaces, furniture, utensils, and textiles. The environment imprinted itself on every visitor, and storytellers understood this. Magic, therefore, was believable when it incorporated these tangible realities. Santa's clothing became a bridge between the fantastic and the familiar, a sensory artifact that connected the magical visitor to the lived experience of children and adults alike. Finally, this aspect of Santa's clothing highlights a deeper truth about Victorian Christmas. It was an immersive, physical experience. Beyond gifts and decoration, Christmas engaged the senses completely. Children smelled the hearth, touched greenery, heard the crackle of fires, and imagined Santa navigating this challenging landscape. His clothing, carrying the imprints of every environment, served as a multi-sensory narrative device, one that allowed storytelling to be richer, more realistic, and more engaging. In essence, every patch of soot, every absorbed scent, and every roughened fiber told a story. By the time Santa departed at dawn, his garments were more than clothing. They were a chronicle of a night spent traversing winter's harsh realities. This record was tangible proof of effort, resilience, and magic grounded in lived experience. So next time you imagine Santa, consider him not as a polished figure of fantasy but as a character deeply intertwined with the environments he visits. His coat tells a story of cold, soot, warmth, and endurance. His gloves and boots map the textures of countless homes. Every piece of clothing is a record, every smell a note in a symphony of winter life. Victorian Santa reminds us that magic, in its truest form, is never divorced from the physical world. It emerges from experience, endurance, and sensory richness. And it is precisely this connection between reality and imagination that allowed Santa to capture hearts, both then and now. As we move forward in our exploration of Victorian Christmas, it is time to consider how children themselves experienced Santa not just as a distant figure delivering gifts, but as a living presence whose visit was intertwined with the very environment of their own homes. While we often imagine modern Christmas as cozy, predictable, and cheerful, the Victorian experience was far more complex, layered with sensory impressions, awe, and even a little fear. When Santa entered a home, he did so through the chimney, often leaving behind traces of soot and the faint, lingering smell of coal smoke. But the true magic and sometimes terror for children came from how these sensory elements interacted with their familiar spaces. Imagine a small Victorian bedroom, dark except for a flickering candle or the glow of a dying fire. The room carried its own set of scents: the earthy smell of wool blankets, the slightly acrid tang of the fireplace, perhaps the residual aroma of yesterday's cooking or dried herbs hung for winter. These were scents children knew intimately. They smelled like home. Now imagine Santa stepping in, bringing with him a blend of otherworldly odors, the mixed smells of soot, damp wool, and winter air from outdoors, plus traces from other homes he had visited that night. The combination was unlike anything the child had experienced before. It was familiar and strange at once, comforting and overwhelming. Children reacted to this intrusion not just intellectually, but viscerally. The room seemed to grow smaller, the shadows deeper, the flickering light more animated. Santa's presence, amplified by smell and sound, could inspire awe and sometimes fear. Fear, in this context, was not intended to be harmful. Victorian storytellers and parents understood that a certain level of fright heightened the magic of Christmas. Children learned that Santa was powerful, elusive, and deserving of respect. Tales emphasized that misbehavior could be noticed, that even the quietest corner of the home was visible to him. The sensory assault of a slightly smoky, heavy, warm presence moving through the room, the brush of a rough coat, the thud of boots on floorboards, The faint smell of soot lingering in the air reinforced the idea that Santa was real, active, and attentive. Awe, on the other hand, came from the sheer wonder of the encounter. Victorian children were taught to anticipate the impossible. A visitor who could appear in one instant and vanish the next, who knew what each child desired without being told. The smells, textures, and sounds of their own home enhanced this experience. A room that smelled of pine, dried apples, or fresh baked bread was suddenly transformed into a stage for the magical. The familiar became extraordinary. Children's reactions, wide eyes, hushed whispers, and gasps were shaped not only by what they saw but by how the environment itself amplified the narrative of Santa's visit. Importantly, children were not passive observers. Their reactions were influenced by a mix of imagination and sensory memory. A faintly burnt scent from a recent hearth fire could suggest Santa's boots had just scuffed the fireplace, even if the child had not seen him. A small pile of ashes could indicate his passage. Even the gentle creak of a floorboard could be interpreted as the soft padding of his steps. Victorian children, with their keen awareness of household life, had a heightened ability to integrate these sensory cues into a cohesive story of Santa's visit. Parents sometimes played a role in shaping these reactions, too. They would exaggerate sounds, leave small hints of footprints or coal dust, and tell carefully timed stories that suggested Santa's presence. By doing so, they cultivated an atmosphere where fear and awe existed in a delicate balance. The goal was never to traumatize. Rather, it was to create a sense of wonder and anticipation that would make Christmas unforgettable. Another key factor in children's reactions was the interplay between imagination and routine. Victorian households were often strict and orderly, with clear expectations for behavior. Santa's sudden, sensory-rich visit disrupted this order in a controlled way. The child who had just finished supper and tidied the room might suddenly notice a strange odor, a tiny disturbance in the hearth, or a shadow flickering against the wall. These minor disruptions allowed children to project stories and magical explanations onto everyday details. The room itself became part of the narrative. Interestingly, the mixture of fear and awe had a lasting impact on how children remembered Christmas. Unlike modern portrayals, where Santa is sanitized and uniform, Victorian memories of Santa were multi-sensory and deeply personal. A child in one household might recall the slightly acrid scent of coal mixed with pine. Another might remember the rough texture of a wool blanket brushing against Santa's coat. These recollections reinforced the magic by making it tangible, something children could almost touch, smell, and hear long after the holiday passed. Victorian writers and illustrators captured these reactions vividly. Books and periodicals often depicted children peeking from behind curtains, wide-eyed and frozen in anticipation. Some were terrified, clutching their blankets, while others were delighted, mouths open in awe. The sensory detail, smudges of soot, the shimmer of candlelight on a brass fireplace, the faint aroma of gingerbread made these illustrations more than decoration. They served as guides for children's imaginations, showing how a mix of fear, wonder, and sensory familiarity could produce a profound experience of magic. The role of smell, in particular, cannot be overstated. Olfactory memory is powerful and often the first to trigger nostalgia. For Victorian children, the combination of home scents with Santa's own aromatic presence created an indelible imprint. The smell of burnt wood, soot, or damp wool became associated with excitement and expectation. Even today, historians note that references to smell appear frequently in diaries, letters, and memoirs describing Christmas in the 19th century. These scents were integral to the story, shaping children's emotions and their interpretations of magical events. Finally, the experience of fear and awe combined to teach subtle social lessons. Victorian society emphasized discipline, obedience, and moral behavior. Santa's sensory presence reinforced these ideals by demonstrating that actions had consequences, and that magic rewarded awareness, patience, and respect. Children who reacted with curiosity and attentiveness were more likely to be rewarded with gifts. Those who ignored or dismissed the signals of his presence might experience mild, imaginative consequences in the narrative. In conclusion, children's reactions to Santa in Victorian times were shaped by a rich tapestry of fear, awe, and sensory familiarity. Their own homes played a critical role in creating these responses, providing both the setting and the materials, sights, sounds, textures, and smells for magical experiences. The interplay of imagination, environment, and carefully guided storytelling ensured that Santa's visit was more than a simple gift delivery. It became an immersive experience, deeply embedded in memory, and one that continues to inform how we imagine Christmas magic today. By understanding how children perceived Santa through the lens of fear, awe, and the tangible environment of their homes, we gain insight not only into Victorian childhood but also into the enduring power of sensory storytelling, the kind that makes magic feel real, personal, and unforgettable. Following the exploration of children's reactions shaped by fear, awe, and the familiar smells of home, we now turn to another critical dimension of Victorian Christmas: the tactile and sensory qualities of Santa's tools and gifts. While today we might think of Santa primarily as a giver of toys and candy, in the 19th century, the physicality of these gifts, along with the objects he used to deliver them, played an essential role in making his presence feel real and memorable. Victorian Santa was not abstract. He was often depicted carrying a sack, a bundle of toys, or a bag of treats, each item carefully chosen to provide sensory feedback to the child. The sack itself, for instance, was made of rough or coarse fabric, burlap, or wool, and its weight was sometimes emphasized in storytelling or illustration. A child could imagine the heft of the bag pressing against Santa's shoulder, the scratchiness of the material brushing against his hands, and the muffled rustle of toys shifting inside. This sensory detail helped bridge the gap between imagination and perceived reality. The sack was not just a prop, it was a tangible connection to the magical visitor. Inside this sack, the gifts were deliberately designed to stimulate multiple senses. Dolls had movable limbs, glass eyes that seemed to sparkle, and hair that could be brushed. Wooden toys, such as soldiers, animals, or miniature furniture, were smooth yet solid, often polished or painted, giving children a tactile experience that felt authentic. Even small food gifts, like sugared almonds or miniature cakes, engaged taste and smell, further anchoring the magical narrative. When a child reached into the sack and touched or tasted a gift, the physical experience confirmed Santa's reality. Santa's tools extended beyond gifts. He often carried bells, sticks, or other props, which could produce sound or motion, enhancing the perception of presence. For example, the faint jingle of a bell might signal his approach, creating a multi-sensory anticipation that heightened excitement and attention. In some households, parents would replicate these effects, ringing a small bell or leaving a trail of disturbed items to simulate Santa's passage. Each touch, sound, or smell reinforced the narrative that Santa had been there, and that he was a living, moving, and responsive being rather than a distant figure in a storybook. The use of tactile objects was especially important because it allowed children to interact with the magical narrative. They could hold a wooden horse, feel the texture of a doll's dress, or unwrap a piece of candy. This interaction created a form of proof that something extraordinary had occurred. In contrast to stories read from a book or seen in a distant illustration, the physical reality of these items made the event personal and immediate. Children could verify the magic themselves through touch and manipulation, making the experience more convincing and memorable. Moreover, the tactile gifts served as a form of storytelling. A wooden train might spark imagination about travel and adventure. A set of building blocks could inspire architectural creativity. A small musical instrument could produce sound and rhythm, allowing children to engage actively with their gift. These experiences were not passive. They required attention, coordination, and curiosity, which deepened the child's sense of involvement with Santa's world. The more a gift stimulated multiple senses, the more real Santa's visit seemed. Victorian accounts often describe children examining their gifts with wonder, noting details that modern adults might overlook. The smoothness of carved wood, the metallic shine of tiny buttons, or the scent of fresh pine from a wooden toy could all become central to their memory of Christmas. These sensory elements were not accidental. They were integral to the design and delivery of gifts. Artisans and parents understood that magic was more credible when it could be sensed physically. The tactile experience helped children suspend disbelief and accept the extraordinary as plausible. In addition, the contrast between ordinary household items and Santa's magical tools enhanced the experience. A child accustomed to simple, utilitarian toys at home would immediately recognize the difference in texture, craftsmanship, or novelty of a Santa-delivered item. A hand-carved figurine might feel smoother or heavier than ordinary toys. A doll's dress might be silkier or more intricately sewn. These subtle contrasts reinforced the idea that Santa operated in a special, magical realm. The child's interaction with these objects confirmed the uniqueness of the visitor, strengthening the narrative of wonder and reward. Sensory engagement extended beyond gifts to the rituals surrounding their discovery. Victorian children often awoke early, tiptoeing through dimly lit rooms to find presents. They would lift, shake, sniff, and touch each item, exploring its properties in detail. Parents encouraged careful observation, knowing that each tactile discovery enhanced the story of Santa's visit. A rough wooden toy suggested handcrafted skill. A candy's sweet scent hinted at thoughtful selection. A small musical toy's sound seemed like a signature left by the magical visitor. Every sensory cue was a puzzle piece, confirming the reality of the event and reinforcing the child's belief in Santa. The multi-sensory experience also had an emotional impact. Handling tangible gifts triggered feelings of excitement, curiosity, and joy, while also fostering a sense of connection to the broader Christmas narrative. Children learned to associate textures, smells, and sounds with pleasure, reward, and anticipation. This emotional resonance made the event more memorable and shaped lifelong associations with the holiday. Even today, adults recalling Victorian or early 20th century Christmas often remember the physicality of gifts, the weight of a toy, the shine of a doll's eyes, or the crunch of a candy wrapper as much as the story itself. Furthermore, the sensory elements of Santa's tools and gifts reinforced moral lessons and social expectations. Certain gifts were reserved for children who were well-behaved, while smaller or simpler items were given as reminders to improve behavior. The tactile and visual differences communicated social messages subtly. Children could compare the quality, weight, or intricacy of gifts, learning about effort, reward, and expectation. These physical cues made abstract lessons tangible, turning magic into a tool for education and moral reinforcement. Finally, the use of tactile gifts ensured that Santa's visit was an interactive and participatory event rather than a passive observation. Children became active participants in their own magical experience. They explored textures, tested sounds, tasted treats, and marveled at intricate details. Each sensory interaction reinforced the narrative of Santa's real presence, solidifying the event as a formative, immersive, and unforgettable experience. In conclusion, the tactile and sensory qualities of Santa's tools and gifts were central to the realism of his visit in Victorian households. By engaging touch, smell, sight, and even sound, these objects transformed an abstract story into a multi-sensory reality. Children's interactions with these items confirmed Santa's existence, heightened their sense of wonder, and reinforced emotional and moral lessons. Understanding this sensory dimension provides us with a deeper appreciation of how Victorian Christmas magic was created and experienced, reminding us that sometimes the smallest details, a smooth wooden toy, a fragrant candy, or the rustle of a sack, can hold the most enduring power in shaping memory and belief. While individual households carefully crafted the sensory and emotional experiences of Christmas, the magic of Santa Claus in Victorian times was not confined to private homes. His influence and presence extended throughout entire communities, fostering shared anticipation, collective storytelling, and a sense of interconnected wonder. This communal aspect was a crucial dimension of Victorian Christmas that amplified the impact of Santa's mythos and strengthened social bonds. In towns and villages across Britain, Santa's presence was often orchestrated through public events, communal decorations, and shared rituals. Shop windows were meticulously designed with elaborate displays of toys, candies, and festive scenes. These windows served as miniature theaters, allowing children to observe Santa's world in a public setting. The displays were often animated with moving parts, lights, or small mechanisms to enhance the illusion of life. Children would gather outside these shops, pressed against the glass, their eyes wide with excitement, imagining that Santa had personally prepared these wonders for them. Even the act of walking through the streets and seeing multiple displays contributed to a growing sense of anticipation, as if the entire town was alive with Santa's magic. Local churches, community halls, and schools often held festive gatherings where Santa or a Santa figure might appear. These events were carefully staged to replicate the sensory and narrative elements familiar from the home environment. Children would witness Santa's arrival, sometimes accompanied by assistants or helpers dressed as elves, hear bells ringing, and even see gifts being distributed. Such public appearances validated the stories told at home and created communal experiences that reinforced belief. Children could compare their stories, gifts, and impressions with peers, generating a shared narrative that strengthened the reality of Santa's presence. Beyond formal events, communal anticipation was fueled by seasonal customs. Caroling, holiday fairs, and market days often incorporated Santa-like figures or symbolic representations of him. A costumed Santa might appear to greet children, pose for photographs, or supervise small performances. Even in brief encounters, these moments created touchpoints for the imagination. The repeated, shared encounters across different locations created a network of experiences that intertwined private belief with public spectacle. This blending of personal and communal experience amplified the emotional and cultural resonance of Santa Claus. Stories of Santa were also exchanged among children and families, reinforcing community-wide engagement. Victorian children often shared tales of their own or neighbors' Santa encounters, sometimes embellishing details to enhance drama or excitement. These narratives were passed orally, written in letters, or recounted during social gatherings. Each retelling added layers of detail, imagination, and plausibility. For example, a child might describe the texture of Santa's sack or the scent of a particular candy, while another would recount the sound of bells or the glow of candles reflecting on gifts. Over time, these shared stories became a collective tapestry, weaving individual experiences into a communal mythology that strengthened belief and anticipation. The influence of local newspapers and periodicals also contributed to community-wide Santa engagement. Newspapers published seasonal illustrations, gift suggestions, and moral stories centered around Santa. Some periodicals included letters from Santa or advice columns encouraging children to behave in order to receive gifts. These widely distributed texts ensured that Santa's presence transcended the home and reached a broader audience, linking households through shared symbols, expectations, and cultural practices. Children who had not yet experienced their first Santa visit were primed by reading about him, while those who had could validate their personal experiences through public narratives. Community anticipation extended beyond sensory engagement to temporal experience. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, towns and neighborhoods were imbued with the rhythm of preparation. Streets were decorated, windows were lit, and schedules of local events were shared. Children internalized this rhythm, counting down the days and noting the subtle signs of Santa's imminent arrival. The shared timing of these events created a communal sense of expectation, as if the entire town collectively awaited the magic. Parents reinforced this anticipation by referencing neighbors' preparations, subtly connecting each household's efforts to a larger, socialized narrative. Furthermore, communal activities often encouraged moral education and social cohesion. Public Santa events and shared narratives emphasized good behavior, generosity, and kindness. Children who behaved appropriately were celebrated and rewarded, not only within their household but in a communal context. This reinforced both individual and societal values, teaching that magic and reward were tied to ethics, cooperation, and mutual respect. The presence of Santa in the community thus served as a tool for socialization, shaping both imagination and behavior across broader networks. The community-wide nature of Santa's presence also provided a mechanism for inclusion and social bonding. Children who had similar experiences could discuss them, compare gifts, and participate in communal festivities. Families and neighbors exchanged advice, stories, and sometimes even gifts to ensure no child felt excluded. This sense of participation strengthened social ties, fostering a network of interdependent relationships rooted in shared seasonal experiences. Even those who were less privileged could partake in the communal magic, ensuring that Santa's influence was inclusive and widespread. In addition, communal anticipation often amplified the emotional intensity of individual experiences. When children saw their friends or siblings reacting to Santa's gifts, they experienced vicarious excitement and wonder. The social reinforcement of belief heightened the personal impact of Santa's visit, as children understood that others were also witnessing, enjoying, and validating the magic. This dynamic created a feedback loop. Anticipation built excitement, which fueled more attention to detail and engagement, reinforcing the communal narrative and making Santa's presence more vivid and credible. Seasonal fairs and parades further extended Santa's visibility. In some regions, costumed figures might traverse town streets, distribute small treats, or oversee performances that dramatized the Christmas story. These public spectacles provided visual, auditory, and social cues that anchored Santa in the collective consciousness. Children could encounter Santa in multiple contexts at home, at school, in public gatherings, creating layered experiences that bridged private imagination and public reality. The more frequently Santa was encountered, the more reinforced the belief became, extending his influence across neighborhoods and communities. Finally, the communal presence of Santa created enduring cultural memory. By linking individual experiences with public rituals, stories, and spectacles, Victorian society ensured that Santa became a shared symbol across generations. Children who grew up immersed in this multi-sensory and social narrative often carried their memories into adulthood, passing the stories, rituals, and expectations to their own children. The communal framework thus preserved Santa's mythology, ensuring that the magic of his presence remained culturally resonant beyond any single household or year. In conclusion, the Victorian Santa Claus was not only a visitor to individual homes but a pervasive presence within communities. Through public displays, shared stories, seasonal events, and newspapers, his influence extended across towns and neighborhoods, creating collective anticipation, reinforcing moral and social lessons, and fostering a shared sense of wonder. This community-wide engagement magnified the emotional and cognitive impact of Santa's narrative, ensuring that belief in his magic was both personally meaningful and socially reinforced. Understanding this communal dimension highlights the ways in which Victorian society orchestrated and maintained the magic of Christmas, demonstrating that Santa's power relied not only on gifts and stories but also on a broader network of shared experience, anticipation, and imagination. The Santa Claus of Victorian Britain was a figure rooted in tradition, but his image was far from fixed. Over the decades, his appearance, personality, and associated rituals evolved under the influence of literature, visual art, and early commercialization. Understanding this evolution sheds light on how cultural, artistic, and economic forces intertwined to shape the Santa we recognize today. One of the most significant influences on Santa's image was literature. In the 19th century, stories and poems helped solidify the narrative of a jolly, benevolent gift-giver. Writers drew from a variety of sources, blending folklore, religious traditions, and imaginative inventions to create a character that resonated with children and adults alike. For instance, works like A Visit from St. Nicholas, commonly known as The Night Before Christmas, published in 1823, portrayed Santa as a rotund, cheerful man who traveled in a sleigh pulled by reindeer, delivering presents while evoking a sense of warmth and wonder. These literary depictions offered concrete details about Santa's appearance, demeanor, and methods, influencing the way families and communities envisioned him. Children internalized these stories, while parents used them as tools to enhance holiday magic. Visual art also played a crucial role in shaping Santa's image. Illustrators began depicting Santa in a consistent manner that emphasized recognizable features: a round, cheerful face, a long white beard, a red or fur-trimmed suit, and a benevolent smile. Periodicals, children's books, and newspapers frequently published these images, allowing readers to see a tangible representation of the literary character. Artists such as Thomas Nast in the United States contributed significantly to the visual codification of Santa, and their work circulated widely, even influencing British interpretations. Illustrations not only reinforced literary descriptions but also introduced new visual details, such as Santa's workshop, elves, or the arrangement of gifts, creating a richer, more immersive imaginative world. The evolving visual image of Santa also reflected broader cultural values and aesthetic trends. In Victorian Britain, societal ideals of domesticity, morality, and decorum influenced how Santa was portrayed. He was often shown as a dignified, kind-hearted figure who embodied generosity, wisdom, and cheerfulness. These artistic portrayals underscored moral lessons, linking material gifts to ethical behavior. Children were encouraged to see Santa not merely as a source of toys, but as a symbol of virtue, kindness, and social harmony. This moral framing made Santa's image more than a simple entertainer. He became a cultural icon, embodying societal ideals of care, community, and ethical behavior. Commercialization also shaped Santa's image, especially as Christmas became increasingly associated with consumer culture. By the late 19th century, shops, catalogs, and advertisements began using Santa as a marketing figure to encourage gift buying. Retailers commissioned illustrations of Santa in colorful prints, emphasizing the abundance of toys, sweets, and other presents. These depictions reinforced the connection between Santa and material generosity, subtly promoting consumption while maintaining the narrative of magical benevolence. Children's imaginations were intertwined with commercial imagery, creating a blend of fantasy and material expectation that further solidified Santa's cultural significance. The commercialization of Santa did not merely change his appearance, it also influenced the rituals associated with him. Department stores and shop windows often staged elaborate Santa displays, complete with costumes, sleighs, and gift arrangements. These visual spectacles allowed children to encounter a real Santa in public spaces, creating an interactive experience that reinforced both belief and consumer engagement. The public visibility of Santa in these contexts elevated him from a household figure to a societal phenomenon, making him a symbol of the season's cultural and economic activity. Santa's evolving image also reflected regional adaptations and international influences. British, Dutch, and American traditions intertwined, resulting in a composite figure that combined elements from St. Nicholas, Father Christmas, and local folklore. Literature and art facilitated the spread of these hybridized characteristics, ensuring that Santa could be recognized across diverse communities while still allowing for local variations. These adaptations allowed the character to remain culturally relevant and appealing, demonstrating the flexibility and resilience of his mythology. Another factor in Santa's evolution was the interplay between imagination and realism. Artists and writers often sought to balance magical elements with relatable human features. Santa's jolly face, twinkling eyes, and rotund physique conveyed warmth and approachability, while the sleigh, reindeer, and North Pole setting provided fantastical context. This combination allowed children to suspend disbelief while still engaging with the story in a believable way. Families could enact rituals, such as leaving out stockings or setting up miniature sleighs, that mirrored these literary and artistic depictions, creating immersive, participatory experiences. Over time, these literary, artistic, and commercial influences became self-reinforcing. Once Santa's appearance and associated narratives gained popularity, publishers, illustrators, and merchants followed suit, adhering to established imagery and motifs. Deviations from the canonical image were less common, ensuring consistency across media and generations. Children who encountered Santa in multiple contexts, books, illustrations, advertisements, or public appearances developed a cohesive mental image, solidifying belief and anticipation. The evolution of Santa's image also highlights the dynamic relationship between imagination and cultural transmission. While initial depictions were fluid, as the character became codified through literature, art, and commerce, Santa's image became more standardized. Yet even within this standardization, creative interpretation remained possible. Illustrators could vary costumes, reindeer poses, or workshop layouts, while writers could invent new adventures, gifts, or moral lessons. This balance between consistency and creativity ensured that Santa remained both recognizable and endlessly captivating. Finally, the evolving image of Santa demonstrates the convergence of multiple societal forces: cultural, artistic, moral, and commercial, in shaping collective imagination. His figure became a vessel for conveying values, stories, and expectations, while also supporting emerging consumer practices. Through literature, art, and commercialization, Santa transitioned from a folkloric figure into a universally recognized symbol of Christmas magic, bridging the private and public, the fantastical and the moral, the imaginative and the material. In summary, Santa Claus in Victorian Britain did not emerge fully formed. His image was the product of ongoing evolution influenced by literature, visual art, and commercialization. Literary works established narrative and moral dimensions, while illustrations concretized his appearance and surroundings. Commercialization amplified visibility, linked Santa to gift-giving, and created immersive public encounters. Together, these forces shaped a figure who was both culturally resonant and emotionally compelling, ensuring that Santa's magic extended across homes, communities, and generations. Understanding this evolution illuminates not only the origins of our modern Santa but also the broader processes by which cultural icons are formed, adapted, and perpetuated. As we reach the final chapter of our journey through the evolution of Santa Claus in Victorian Britain, it is important to pause and reflect on the lasting influence of this iconic figure. Santa Claus, in all his literary, artistic, and commercial iterations, has become much more than a character in holiday stories. He represents a bridge between imagination, morality, culture, and community. His evolution demonstrates how traditions are shaped, transmitted, and transformed over time, leaving a mark on both individual lives and society at large. One of the most striking aspects of Santa's enduring influence is his ability to inspire imagination and wonder. For children in Victorian Britain, Santa was not merely a man who delivered gifts. He was a symbol of magic, hope, and the excitement of anticipation. The stories, illustrations, and public representations of Santa created a shared imaginative world where children could suspend disbelief and immerse themselves in fantastical experiences. This imaginative engagement continues to be one of Santa's most powerful legacies, as children today still eagerly await his arrival on Christmas Eve, hang stockings, and imagine the North Pole workshop bustling with elves. The capacity to spark imagination has allowed Santa to transcend generations, cultures, and even centuries, proving the enduring appeal of a figure rooted in wonder and delight. Santa's role as a moral figure is another aspect of his lasting influence. The traditions associated with Santa often included subtle ethical lessons. Children were encouraged to be kind, obedient, and generous, with the promise of rewards for good behavior. Victorian stories and illustrations reinforced these lessons, positioning Santa as both a magical and moral authority. This moral dimension continues to shape modern interpretations of Santa, reminding children and adults alike of the values of empathy, generosity, and community. In a sense, Santa has become a vessel for transmitting cultural and ethical norms, offering an imaginative framework in which lessons are embedded within playful and joyful experiences. The commercialization of Santa, which began in the Victorian era and accelerated in the 20th century, has also played a significant role in solidifying his place in modern culture. By linking Santa with gift-giving, advertising, and public displays, merchants and media amplified his visibility and appeal. Department stores, holiday catalogs, and later mass media, including television and films, created ubiquitous images of Santa that reached wide audiences. This commercialization did not diminish the magic of Santa. Rather, it provided new avenues for families to engage with his story. Children could see Santa in stores, in advertisements, and in movies, reinforcing the sense of a shared cultural experience. The commercialization of Santa demonstrates how economic and cultural forces can coexist with imagination and tradition, shaping a character that is both magical and culturally pervasive. Santa's adaptability is another reason for his lasting impact. Over the centuries, he has absorbed elements from various cultures, including St. Nicholas traditions, Father Christmas, and regional folklore. Literature and art provided the framework for these integrations, ensuring that Santa could remain relevant across different communities. This adaptability allowed Santa to become a truly global figure, recognized and celebrated in diverse cultural contexts while maintaining core characteristics, jolliness, generosity, and a connection to children. Santa's evolution highlights the dynamic nature of cultural symbols, showing that enduring figures are often those that can adapt to changing social, cultural, and economic landscapes. The continued popularity of Santa also reflects the importance of shared cultural rituals. Christmas, and the figure of Santa within it, creates opportunities for families and communities to participate in collective traditions. Whether through decorating a tree, hanging stockings, or exchanging gifts, these rituals create a sense of continuity, belonging, and shared memory. Victorian innovations, such as Santa letters, illustrated books, and public appearances, laid the foundation for many of these enduring practices. These rituals reinforce the social and emotional power of Santa, allowing him to remain relevant and meaningful in contemporary life. Santa Claus also serves as a reminder of the human desire for storytelling and narrative. From the earliest folktales to Victorian literature, illustrations, and advertisements, Santa's story has been told and retold in countless forms. Each generation contributes new interpretations, expanding the narrative while preserving its core elements. This ongoing storytelling reinforces cultural memory, creating continuity across time and connecting past and present audiences. By participating in these narratives, children and adults alike become part of a larger cultural tapestry, experiencing both the joy of the story and the communal bonds it fosters. Moreover, Santa's influence extends beyond children's experiences to broader cultural expressions. In literature, film, music, and art, Santa has inspired countless creative works, from poems and short stories to major films and animated specials. His image has been reinterpreted and celebrated in diverse media, demonstrating the flexibility and universality of his appeal. Artists and creators continue to find new ways to explore and reinterpret Santa's character, ensuring that he remains a vibrant, living symbol within popular culture. Santa's lasting influence also lies in his embodiment of hope and continuity. In times of social or economic upheaval, Santa's consistent presence has offered reassurance and stability. Victorian Britain faced rapid industrialization, urbanization, and changing social norms, yet the figure of Santa provided a comforting symbol of generosity, joy, and familial connection. This ability to provide emotional resonance, even amidst uncertainty, is part of why Santa endures as a cultural icon. In modern times, he continues to serve a similar function, offering a sense of continuity and joy during the holiday season, connecting individuals with broader cultural traditions. Finally, the legacy of Santa Claus highlights the interplay of imagination, culture, morality, and commerce in shaping enduring cultural symbols. Through literature, art, public displays, and commercial initiatives, Santa has been transformed from a folkloric figure into a universally recognized icon of Christmas magic. His evolution demonstrates the complex processes by which cultural figures are created, disseminated, and preserved. More importantly, Santa's story illustrates how a single character can evoke wonder, teach ethical lessons, foster community, and provide joy across generations. In conclusion, the figure of Santa Claus in Victorian Britain laid the foundation for the enduring magic of Christmas that continues to captivate the world today. His story reflects the power of imagination, the importance of shared rituals, and the influence of cultural, artistic, and commercial forces in shaping collective memory. Santa is more than a man in a red suit. He is a symbol of generosity, joy, and the enduring capacity of human culture to inspire wonder. By understanding his evolution, we gain insight not only into a beloved holiday figure but also into the ways in which stories, art, and culture can shape the imagination and hearts of generations. As we celebrate the magic of Santa Claus today, it is worth remembering that every story, illustration, and tradition contributes to a legacy that has lasted for centuries. The North Pole, the reindeer, the elves, and the sleigh are more than whimsical details. They are part of a cultural phenomenon that continues to unite families, delight children, and remind us of the joy, hope, and generosity that define the spirit of Christmas. Santa Claus endures not just because of the gifts he delivers, but because of the magic he inspires, the lessons he conveys, and the traditions he nurtures, ensuring that his presence will remain a cherished part of the holiday season for generations to come. As we wrap up today's journey through the fascinating history and evolution of Santa Claus, it is amazing to see how a single figure can carry so much magic, moral meaning, and cultural influence across centuries. From the imaginative stories of Victorian Britain to the global celebrations we know today, Santa has shown us the power of storytelling, tradition, and shared joy. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration of Christmas history and the magic behind Santa Claus. I hope today's story has sparked your imagination and given you a new perspective on the holiday season. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this journey, and I can't wait to see you again in the next story. Until then, keep the spirit of wonder alive, and have a magical day.